Thank you to everyone who's joined so far. This is Roberta, Elias with the World Wildlife Fund. We'll give people maybe 2 more minutes to get situated, and then we'll begin. Feel free to get 1 more cup of coffee, and we'll start shortly. All right, terrific. We'll get started. Again, I'm Roberta Elias. I'm the Director of Policy and Government Affairs at the World Wildlife Fund. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to my fellow experts here on the phone. I think we have a really exciting conversation that we will be following my short remarks, and then we're hoping to have a really lively chat even here on Zoom afterwards. So we are here today to talk about illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, also known as IUU fishing, as well as forced labor and human rights violations in the seafood supply chain. Both issues we know have significant impacts on individual lives, sustainability, communities, and economies. IUU fishing and forced labor not only co-occur, but enable and magnify each other. The good news is that policymakers, like you in this virtual room, have already taken many important steps, but more can and should be done to jointly address both issues. So I'm honored today to be joined by 3 amazing experts, Dr. Whit Saumweber, Dr. Tabitha Mallory, and Beth Lowell. I'll go into a little bit more background on them in a second, but just to give you a sense of today's presentation, Whit is going to go first and is going to provide a snapshot of what the international picture looks like with a focus on China and what that means for domestic interests and competitiveness. Dr. Mallory will speak next and will provide a deeper look at the role of China in these areas based on her recent research. And Beth will close the station and put both frames in context and what comes next for policymakers. We'll move from that into what we hope will be a lively conversation even here in Zoom. So lastly, for your background, a little more on our speakers. Whit Saumweber is a visiting professor of marine affairs at the University of Rhode Island and a senior affiliate with the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in DC. In that capacity, he manages the Stevenson Ocean Security Project. He examined issues at the nexus of national security and global ocean sustainability and promotes meaningful solutions. Dr. Saumweber has an extensive biography before those most recent roles, including as the President Obama's Associate Director for Ocean and Coastal Policy in the White House, and also as an advisor to the late Senator Daniel Inouye. Dr. Mallory, Tabitha Mallory, is the founder of the consulting firm China Ocean Institute. He's also an affiliate professor at the University of Washington's Jackson School of International Studies. Her research focuses on using Chinese language sources to better understand China's ocean and fisheries policy, making her a great expert for today's conversation. And finally, Beth Lowell is the Deputy Vice President of U.S. Campaigns at Oceana. She's been in that role since 2011 and has led a variety of campaigns, including agency. The conservation community focusing on ocean and wildlife issues here in DC for the last 20 years, with 15 of those being at Oceana. So I'm going to pass things off to Dr. Saumweber, followed by Dr. Mallory, followed by my great colleague Beth Lowell, and then we'll move on to questions. The presentation portion should take about 30 minutes, and we're hoping to have a really robust dialogue after that. So on to you, Whit.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much, Roberta. And just also like to acknowledge my colleague, Amy Lair, who is here. Amy is the director of our Human Rights Initiative at CSIS, and she and I have been working quite closely together on this issue because IUU and human rights challenges are really intertwined. So just thank you, Amy, for also joining us here today. So I'm going to get started. Let's see if I can share my screen here. So as Roberta mentioned, I'm going to do just kind of a little bit of framing on top, and then Tabitha is going to be able to provide, I think, some really great additional detail and some specific sectors. But I wanted to talk kind of a little bit in the broader perspective of IUU as a strategic challenge, and set that up a little bit. I'm going to call back to, I hope folks, maybe some folks on the phone here were able to tune in earlier today to watch a conversation that I had with Admiral Schultz, the Commandant of the Coast Guard, Admiral Faller, the Southcom Commander, Admiral Gallaudet, the Deputy Administrator of NOAA, and Dr. Purser from Department of State's OAS office, about really the idea that IUU has become something more than just a resource issue. It's become something more than something that we worry about from a sustainability perspective. It's become a real strategic challenge for the United States for a variety of reasons. Probably top of that list is because a significant portion of the world thinks about fish a lot more than we do in our daily lives. It matters a lot. Seafood matters a lot to some of the most important parts of the world that we care about from a national security perspective, because of it's a significant portion of those states' natural wealth. And they depend on it either for food security, for trade, for other economic development opportunities. And so it's often really at the top of the list when we want to go and talk to them about various things. They'll come back and ask about fish. For anybody who's ever attended a Commerce CJS hearing, you'll probably be familiar with the Secretary of Commerce coming in and wanting to talk about the census, and all he gets is questions about NOAA. And fisheries. I think maybe you can be sympathetic. I think that plays out in a much broader scale around the globe, where seafood is a real central importance to many, many, many folks. Now that's a problem, of course, because as I think probably most of you know, we really have maxed out on our ability to take any more fish from the ocean. These are various estimates of the amount of catch. The official FAO catch is topping out right around 85 million metric tons, and it's been there for maybe 20 or 30 years. But estimates of the actual catch, when you add in things like IUU and underreporting from countries, is potentially as high as 125, 130 million metric tons. And it's either flat or even declining a little bit in recent years. The problem, of course, is that we continue to add people. Lots more folks on planet Earth than there were even 10 years ago, and there are going to be a lot more folks in 10 or 20 years from now. Current estimates assume that we're going to top out around 11 billion over the next 50 years or so. Not only are we increasing the population, of course, but our reliance on fish as a protein source is also increasing. So on a per capita rate, we are increasing our consumption of fish as a source of protein globally. And so together, we're placing a tremendous demand on an already stressed resource. Now, we can make up some of that gap with aquaculture, but not nearly enough. And certainly not with current technologies. So how do we go about dealing with this challenge? Well, we have to think about ways of being more resourceful in terms of sustainable management approaches. We have to think about the issue of climate change and how be proactive in managing for changes in resource allocation and distribution as marine ecosystems shift. And we need to think about ocean governance and making sure that strong governance norms are in place globally to help us support better management. So this brings us to China. And China, of course, is now a global leader in exports and imports seafood. We still, as well as the EU, outstrip China in terms of the total number of imports, but they are becoming an increasingly large player. They have articulated a vision of sustainable governance for the fisheries quite publicly. They've taken some high-profile steps over the last couple of years to try and rein in IUU fishing. But these steps and rhetoric are not always matched by reality for a variety of reasons, whether it be intentional state policy or whether it be just decentralized governance. It's a little bit unclear. And I think Tabitha can probably speak to that a little bit more in her talk. What is clear is that when it does reach the point at which the central government in Beijing thinks it matters, they're willing to take action and impose costs on their fleet. But getting them to that point can be challenging. And again, as I say, some of that is because we're not actually sure what the motivating factor is for some of these decisions, whether it's so decentralized that these decisions are really happening at the regional level or even at the business level, or whether there's actually a tie into broader state strategic interests. Something that might suggest the latter, well, here, this is just quickly some graphs to support to illustrate, I should say, how much things have changed with regard to China and seafood over the past 20, 30 years. So this is a chart showing how imports and exports have doubled for China for seafood. And that this has in large part been matched by a dramatic increase in the amount of distant water fishing that China has been undertaking over the last 20 years. And that's in part because their domestic stocks have really collapsed. They're going through something similar to what we did in the mid-90s when our domestic stocks collapsed. Whereas we turned to primarily an import nation, China has increased production by exporting their fishing capacity abroad. So as I said, there are, how do we divine motives when it comes to Chinese fishing policy? Well, one thing that we've been taking a look at CSIS is this growing constellation of fishing bases that China has been exporting around the globe. Officially, these fish bases are part of what's known as the Belt and Road Initiative, that is China's foreign infrastructure investment policy. But for those who are familiar with the BRI can be kind of everything and anything to a certain extent, except that it is aligned with China's broad strategic interests. And so what you have is a situation where Chinese state investment or state-supported private enterprise is investing significant sums in fishery bases abroad around the globe in key spots. What you see here is that pictured on the top is a fish base that has received about $100 million investment in Ouagadougou, Mauritania. The bottom picture is a shot of the artisanal port just a few miles northeast of the Chinese fish base. And what you can notice is that the artisanal port is, of course, filled with smaller, often just a few crew canoes and similar sorts of vessels, whereas the Chinese base is filled with 150-foot fishing trawlers. And so the kind of fishing is often quite different. What these fish bases are doing in terms of aggregating catch is quite significant in some cases. You're seeing a huge amount of industrial catch compared to the amount of artisanal catch that's supported. And oftentimes the catch that's landed in these fish bases is not going to the local population or is being taken out of local economies. And in this case, in Ouagadougou, the fish are being sent to fish meal plants to support agriculture back in China. So really being taken out of the local economy in a significant way. This kind of investment, on the surface, you might think, well, economic investment is good, especially in places that are infrastructure poor. But in cases like this, they really present a challenge because, as I mentioned, they're taking the resource, natural wealth, really out of the local economy in a number of ways. And the potential for impacting the sovereignty of the local state, the ability to sustainably manage the state's resources, and ultimately to engender security risks is quite high. These are examples from around the globe of Chinese investments in fishery bases. And as you can see, there's quite a number of significant investments that we've mapped around the globe. So how do we begin to think about this in policy context, and how do we begin to think about what we might do to counter these kinds of investments, to counter their impact on local economies, to counter their influence to a certain extent, and to support policy solutions that improve multilateral relations, that support sustainability, that improve development opportunities for local coastal states. I think we clearly need to support increased capacity building and investment in fisheries management in developing states. We need to advance a sustainable U.S. alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative. We've taken some steps in recent years to take a renewed approach to foreign infrastructure investment here in the States. We need to double down on that, but we also need to make sure that as we're doing so, we're recognizing sustainability and response to climate change as a key plank in how we go about making those investments. Rhetoric in this space really matters, and our ability to counter China's investments with investments of our own is really important. Need to engage international fora, to recommit to ourselves to the WTO, to negotiations over BB&J, biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions, UN biodiversity, port state measures agreement, and other multilateral fisheries agreements. And the last point's really key, and I'll close there. The idea that we want to have a multilateral rather than a bilateral ocean. Individual agreements between China, a large, strong state, and individual weak states are inevitably going to be uneven, and they carry at least the appearance, if not in almost many cases, and certainly in many cases, the actuality of an unfair arrangement. Really, ocean management needs to be multilateral. We need to be sort of supporting regional agreements wherever we can. I'll go ahead and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, I'm next up. Good afternoon, everyone. And I want to thank Oceana for hosting this great event. And also thanks to Roberta for moderating, and thanks to the audience for joining us for a really important topic. So I am gonna, well, first share my slides. So what I'm gonna do is talk a little bit, I'll start off talking about China and IUU fishing a little generally to give some context, and then I'll move into talking about some of the drivers of Chinese IUU fishing and some potential solutions. And I think a lot of my remarks will kind of fit with Whit's very well. So I think it's important when we think about China and IUU fishing from a very general perspective to keep in mind that the policy outcomes on IUU fishing vary depending on where the IUU fishing is taking place. So China is actually very strict with IUU fishing in its domestic waters. It's easy. Actually, China considers its domestic industry to be any fishing on the Yellow Sea, East China Sea, or South China Sea. So they do have the capability to enforce their measures against IUU fishing very well. It's easier in domestic waters because it's closer and they feel the impact more directly of poor management. South China Sea is a little different just given the maritime claims that are happening there, and China cares more about the maritime claims than it does IUU fishing, even though it is concerned about IUU fishing, but the priority is on the maritime claims. So it's kind of a special case. And then distant water fishing is what I'll mostly focus on, and I'll kind of go over this really fast because I think people are probably largely familiar with it and went over a lot of the concerns. But here's where we see concerns. Well, first of all, distant water fishing is the operations that happen on the high seas, which are outside the jurisdiction of any country, and then in the EEZs or coastal waters of other countries. So this is not including anything on the Yellow Sea, South China Sea, or East China Sea. And so here's where we have the concerns about poor governance in host countries and the impact of unsustainable fishing on the socioeconomic circumstances, the environment in these host countries. As Whit mentioned, a lot of concern about the ports and fish bases that are being built around the world to support the infrastructure for the industry, as well as some of the distant water fishing ports that are being built at home where China is sending a lot of its catch. There are concerns about Chinese fishing on the high seas. The high seas is much less regulated. Host countries have control over their EEZs, but with the high seas, there's a patchwork of regional fisheries management organizations. There's no comprehensive framework. And China is taking advantage of that. So it used to be less than half of China's distant water catch came from the high seas, and now it's 2/3. So there's really a move away from the EEZ fishing towards high seas. And then concerns over global political influence from a state that has little transparency, for example, using economic incentives or coercion to get other countries to kind of comply with China's desires. And then also the human rights concerns for crew and other, links to other criminal activities. I'll turn now to talking about some of the policy responses. So as Whit also mentioned, there has in the past few years been some positive responses to IUU fishing, particularly related to distant water fleet. And these are really good steps, starting around the mid 2010. So these are in kind of chronological order. So there's first commitments to reduce fishery subsidies, although alongside that has been a decrease in transparency, which I'll get to in a minute. Talk about strengthening the observer program on board the vessels. They launched a new distant water fishing training and compliance center at Shanghai Ocean University. There have been some changes to the 13th five-year plan. So not just at the national level, but also the general fisheries five-year plan and the one specifically for distant water fishing. So this is where the cap for, at 3,000 fishing vessels was announced. And also a move away from a policy that's focused on just pure expansion of the industry and catch, and more towards consolidating the seafood supply chain, which has other implications, which we can also discuss. Earlier this year, China released its updated distant water fishing regulations. They were revised significantly for the first time since 2003. There's been a couple other revisions since then, but these were very significant. So it included language, and you can kind of, it's kind of like advertisers who talk about, something that they do really well, that kind of indicates the problems that they've had. I kind of see the distant water fishing regulations to be like this, like the issues that they're addressing kind of show that they're, like these are the things they've been struggling with. So there's, they included IUU fishing language for the first time, which is great. They used to, deny that there was any problem. But, you see a lot of new language on how to address joint ventures that are happening, Chinese wholly owned enterprises overseas, reflagging, issues with the Chinese fleets. They're told they should now leave a buffer zone between their fishing activities and areas that are off limits. So to me, this indicates that there's an awareness of, some of the international feedback that they've gotten about the activities of their fleets, and they're working to address that. Also, the IUU blacklist was put into these regulations, and some other penalties like taking subsidies away from the violators. And then just a couple months ago, the first Chinese high seas two fishing moratoria regions were announced for squid. And then starting next year, there'll be some measures to govern high seas transshipment of catch. So these are all really positive developments. That the screenshot I have on the right-hand side is the new distant water fishing regulations. But one really big question here is, how is China going to implement and enforce all these new regulations, all these new measures? And as I mentioned, in some cases, some of the policies could still be problematic, like consolidating the seafood supply chain. I'll talk more about that in a minute. So when we think about drivers for the distant water fishing industry, it's really important to keep in mind the amount of money that the Chinese fleet is getting from the government. China is the world's largest provider of subsidies to its distant water, or to its fishing fleet. And in this article that came out last year that I helped contribute to, we estimated that for 2018, China provided 21% of the global total and 27% of the global total of harmful subsidies. So these are the capacity enhancing subsidies, like fuel subsidies and vessel construction and renovation. And while all this has been going on, there's been a decrease in transparency. So, like I mentioned in the previous slide, China announced a few years back that they are rolling back some of their subsidies, but we can't really verify that because the transparency has been decreasing at the same time. So if you look at the left-hand side of the slide, this is a shot of the fisheries yearbook from 2009 and the section that reports the subsidy programs. And so the part that's in the green brackets of like the left-hand side of the paper and up onto the right-hand side, that's all the data they used to provide. And if you compare it to the right-hand side, this is the 2018 yearbook, it's only that little tiny paragraph at the bottom indicated by the green bracket. So there's just been, it's just, they just kind of provide these overall figures of what they're, giving, but there's no breakdown as to what kinds of programs these subsidies are going to. And then it's, it makes it really hard to determine if they're beneficial or not. And it's, like Whit said too, it's important to keep in mind that we've got negotiations going on at the WTO right now, and China is pushing to get special and differentiated treatment as a developing country. So it has the largest fleet, but it also wants to, have lower standards than other countries and a longer time to implement the deal. And then if you just, just kind of continue the point about the subsidies, if you just follow the money, you see what an impact this has. So if you look at the share of distant water fishing catch in 2018 by province, the three largest provinces for catch are Zhejiang, Fujian, and Shandong provinces. And if you look at, this is for one distant water fishing subsidy program. This is not necessarily comprehensive, but one of the big ones. If you look at the share of the provinces, how much they get in subsidies from the government for the same year, you see it's the same provinces. So the ones that are catching the most are also getting the most money. I mean, it just matches up. It's kind of what you would expect. And then also coincidentally, those three provinces are the ones that are hosting China's first national distant water fishing bases. So this is an effort to bring more of the catch home to China as they, so as I mentioned, that consolidating the supply chain, they want to have the capability to control the catch from the point of harvest all the way through to the domestic market in China. Whereas in the past, they didn't have the capability, like the storage facilities, the technology. It's very like high capital intensive, like, vessel technology that you need to have to store fish at the right temperatures. So they're building all of that up and sending a lot more of their catch home. So the first one was built in Zhejiang. This is operational now. This is where a lot of the squid from around the Galapagos is going. So it hits the Chinese market. The second one is in Shandong, and the third one was just approved last year to be built in Fujian. So it's pretty striking, I think, when you look at where the money is and who's bringing in the most catch and just kind of connect the dots. So I want to talk a little bit about the Chinese seafood trade. Whit also brought this up, and I think it's, it's really important to consider, solutions in this area. So in 2018, China imported over 5 million tons of seafood, worth a pretty penny, also exported about 4 million tons of seafood. And so that's about all we know, really. The breakdown of the trade is kind of a black box. And that's a problem when we consider that the US sends a lot of its seafood over to China for processing. So like pollock, for example, we send a lot of our Alaska pollock over there as whole fish or partially processed, and then we re-import the fillets back from China. But there are some labeling issues there. Often if you add enough value through the processing, then you can say that that product is from your country. So even though it's caught in the US, it might still say it's a product of China. And so there's a report that came out last year with saying that this often cited statistic that the US imports 90% of its seafood is actually probably incorrect. And we probably only import about 62 to 65%. And the rest, the gap is accounted for by that, just that we don't really trace and know like where our seafood's going out for processing and then coming back in. And this is not just China, but we send a lot of our seafood out for processing. So improving that would be really helpful. Having the labeling requirements include the country of origin plus the country of consignment, which is the country that would process it. So if we think a little bit more about China's seafood traceability system, so here's this great framework that a lot of people, including WWF, is working on rolling out globally. And it's this framework to think about seafood traceability in terms of the critical tracking events where the seafood changes hands, and also the key data elements, which is the information that you need at each of those points. So it's, to trace the seafood from point of harvest, whether or not there's any bycatch, whether or not it's been transshipped, landing, processing, and distribution to the market. So what we did recently, my staff and I, we took this framework and analyzed China's traceability system in terms of this framework. And what we showed was, so for most of this framework, China does not have all those data points in place. So they're not capturing all of this. And there are some voluntary seafood traceability standards in China, but they're not rolled out. They're not required. They're not rolled out nationwide. There's also some pilot projects and, you know, some different provincial requirements, but at the national level, there's really only in place some requirements for point of harvest, which is great. So those X's on the rightmost column indicate that those are required at the national level. But then if you go through to these other critical tracking events, in terms of retained bycatch, transshipment, transportation and landing, they don't require that at the national level at all. So processing stages, distribution, and in some cases, they'll require some of this information, but not at the level of the global standards. And then finally, this is kind of my last points here. Another really important issue is the customs code. So the harmonized system codes that were created by the World Customs Organization. And so these are standardized to 6 digits at the international level, but then countries are able to add a few more digits to get you know, another layer of detail. And so this chart, you don't have to read all of this, it's just to kind of make the point. This is comparing China's customs codes with the US customs codes. And so on this first slide, you see there's like, you know, China has a bunch, the US has a bunch, but the US keeps going. So here's the second slide. Here's still all the detail we have for salmon. I don't know if I mentioned this is salmon. And then the third slide. So you can see, you know, the US has much more detail about the different types of salmon that is traded than China does. And so that's an entry point for IUU fish. And currently the seafood import monitoring program doesn't cover salmon. So this would be really, you know, great to cover. And this is just comparing US and China. You know, there's still other countries that trade salmon whose customs codes don't necessarily match. And salmon is also, there's like 6 or 7 species. You know, if we think about, this is almost my last slide. If we think about squid, squid has, and this is, you know, what a lot of the Chinese fleet in the Galapagos is fishing for. It's unregulated right now, and we don't have the level of granularity about the genus or species to really trace this trait. So we could be importing squid that is coming, you know, from these unregulated fisheries. And so this is US squid imports from China. And as you can see, you know, for a couple of species, we have, you know, the species level detail, but you know, for one of the genuses, it's just all lumped together. And then, you know, for a large portion of it, we don't even know what the genus is for the species. So, so those are kind of some of the issues that I see that we can work on, and I will end there and look forward to any questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Tabitha. It's now on to me. Again, I'm Beth Lowell with Oceana. Let me just pull up my slides for you all. So I'm going to talk to you all about the U.S. And this fight against IUU fishing. Thanks to the other panelists and Roberta for moderating. We've talked a lot about China, and I want to bring it back home to the U.S. As well as provide an example, a little bit more information about what's happening at the Galapagos Islands. Oh, sorry, we're not. My PowerPoint is frozen, so I'm gonna talk amongst yourselves while I end the slideshow and restart it, and I'll stop screen sharing. That's what happens when you try to be prepared here. Okay, let's start screen sharing again.
This would be a great time while Beth works on her technology. Zoom is very hard for people to start thinking about questions. I'll be going through those and ready to start grilling our panelists when Beth is done.
Now you're seeing my second slide, correct? Okay. So we all know, my previous panelists have stated this already, illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. It's violating conservation and management laws like quotas, gear restrictions, fishing in closed areas. It's off the books, or even fishing without authorizations in areas that aren't managed. We know it's a multi-billion-dollar industry with products that compete with legal ones, undermining those who are playing by the rules. IUU fishing threatens jobs and food security for millions of people around the world. And it undermines a lot of the issues that many of you in Zoom boxes on this call work on or care about. So whether it's scientifically based catch limits to end overfishing, protecting habitat or wildlife, expanding transparency, or securing a supply chain. But it also can co-occur with other crimes like forced labor and human trafficking. Then, as other of my panelists have mentioned, the very policies that changes needed for IUU fishing are similar for forced labor, human trafficking, and other human rights abuses. We need more documentation, we need traceability in supply chains, and transparency. So overall, I think the United States needs to do better on these issues. We need to shift to a one government approach to address these co-occurring crimes, rather than pretending that individual agencies have individual roles and individual sets of information that are only relevant to them. We need to take a step back and improve the coordination and collaboration within the US government as a whole over these shared goals. And at the end of the day, we need to ensure that all seafood that's sold in the United States is safe and legally caught, responsibly sourced, and honestly labeled. Before I dive in a bit into more of the policy details, I wanted to share an example of an analysis that Oceana released this week on the China's distant water fishing around the Galapagos Islands. So what you're seeing here are the orange dots that are jumping around on your slide are fishing events by the Chinese fleet. And of course, the Galapagos Islands, you can see within that ring that they're hovering near. So we use Global Fishing Watch to do this analysis. You could go online right now to globalfishingwatch.org, pull up the same map and do this yourself if you like. The map is powered by vessel tracking devices that many fishing vessels carry. The boats are sending signals that can be picked up by other vessels, land-based or satellite receivers. And then Global Fishing Watch takes all of this data, uses machine learning and neural networks, and distills it down to just the fishing events on the map. Without Global Fishing Watch, you would see a bunch of data points and boats transiting all around. It would be like a pile of spaghetti. So what you're seeing is each of these points is actual fishing activity, and each of these points is transparency of fishing that was once out of sight. So as we heard earlier, China's impact on the global oceans is massive. In fact, China's own National Distant Water Fishing Association estimates that its fleet accounts for 50 to 70% of the squid caught in international waters. Using Global Fishing Watch, in 2020 alone, we could see more than 456,000 hours of Chinese vessels fishing for squid. And this is just not transiting or resting. These were active fishing hours. And this was 3 times larger than the next largest squid fishing fleets combined. And those were Taiwan, Korea, and Argentina. Earlier in the year, this fleet was down around Argentina, fishing right outside of the EEZ, another hotspot for both transshipping as well as squid fishing. It went off the coast of Peru and then has now sort of sat fishing around the Galapagos Islands. So following some earlier reports this summer, we wanted to dive into the details and see what was happening here. And so we just looked at 1 month of data during the summer. And what we found was 99% of the visible fishing vessels were Chinese, 294 to be exact. And in just 1 month alone, they fished for 73,000 hours of fishing. And again, that's not them resting, it's not transiting, that was active fishing hours. Some of these vessels had gaps in their tracking systems. We saw 43 gaps in the data. Most of them were about 2 days in length. 17 was the longest gap. And while you can't prove that anything illegal happened during that gap, it also raises red flags, especially when it's near an area that's close to fishing or right outside an EEZ of a country. So one of the things that this type of tracking can help is give enforcement officials information to flag where they should do additional inspections once these vessels come into port. That's if it returns to port. So next, what you're seeing here, these little dots on the map are transshipping events that we saw. As of August 13th, many of these vessels that we are seeing fishing off the Galapagos Islands hadn't been back in port for over 250 days. They likely were offloading their catch into refrigerated cargo vessels or reefers. So each of these dots that you're seeing here are encounters that are likely transshipping events. Using the data in Global Fishing Watch, we can see when two vessels, a refrigerated cargo vessel and a fishing vessel, are traveling in the same speed and direction over a period of time within a certain distance of each other, have the signature of a transshipping event. And while this transshipping can be legal, it's also a weak link in the chain where illegally caught fish can be laundered with legal catch and gain a new identity. So within the 1 month of data that we looked at, we did see 6 transshipping events. They are mainly with Chinese vessels with one Panamanian flagged but Chinese owned reefer. And there were also 9 other carrier vessels that were Panamanian flagged but Chinese owned that were just hanging around the Galapagos at the same time. So, well, the Galapagos example is an example of why some of these policies that we're pushing for matters: documentation, traceability, and transparency, so we can actually see what's happening out on the oceans. As the groups on this panel and many of you on this call and others have been working on these issues for a long time, I'm not here to say that we haven't made progress in the US, but we have. But we have done some really strong steps forward, but we also need to do more. Incremental advances are good, but we can't fool ourselves into thinking that our work is done. We must continue to advance policies in smart ways that really get to the issues that are driving IUU fishing and the intertwined and co-occurring seafood mislabeling, human trafficking, and labor abuses that are happening around the world. We still have a patchwork of laws, regulations, and authorities in place. We don't have, so one universal agency and law that guides all the work that we do. But the good news is that we do have a full toolbox. This list here are just some of the policy vehicles as well as activities of government agencies that have been happening just over the past few years alone. There's task force, there's bills, there's reporting happening. But the bad news is that we still have a patchwork approach with problems with information sharing or even awareness of other programs or responsibilities across the government as a whole. So despite multiple efforts with working groups and task force and other mechanisms, we still have this siloed approach, especially when it comes to issues that are cross-department, like when we get to fish, trade, supply chain, and labor issues that we're talking about today. I just want to highlight that the Seafood Import Monitoring Program, the first ever import control mechanism on legality of fish that we have in the US, was a huge step forward. But now that it's been in place for a few years, it's time to look at expanding it. So just as a getting everybody on the same page effort, just the Seafood Import Monitoring Program was established via regulations in 2016. It requires catch documentation and traceability for species that are at risk of seafood fraud and IUU fishing. It used a list of principles to determine what's considered at-risk seafood, and the traceability requirements following that fish are from the farm or the boat to the US border. It came into force in 2018 and was expanded to include shrimp and abalone in 2019. One of the, here's the list of priority species that are included under the program. All have been found mislabeled in Oceana seafood fraud studies or in other studies around the world, and many are found in the IUU trade. One of the problems with the system is that it only applies to these species and it does not apply to all seafood. As Tabitha was talking about these harmonized tariff codes, we actually have some in the US that are very specific for salmon, but then we also have some that are just called fish. So you can just put frozen fish fillets as your harmonized tariff code. And while that's not what you're supposed to do if you're importing one of these species that are covered by the program, it does open up loopholes where fish can slip in through the US without the proper documentation. Another issue with the program is that the documentation flow stops at the US border. We really need full chain traceability for supply chain visibility so that buyers can trace back to the origins on legality of catch, labor, and for other reasons. And we need to ensure that the product has integrity all the way from the boat or the farm through the dinner plate. So more is needed overall, and our groups will continue to come back and work to get more policy changes until we get it all the way right. So some of the specifics that we need on this whole government approach is to expand the Seafood Import Monitoring Program to all seafood. This is basic. If not, we're creating a perverse incentive to mislabel fish, which is not the intent of the program. And also, we know illegally caught fish does not just happen in those 13 types of seafood. It can happen in many places around the world and on different species. We also need to align the catch documentation and other key data elements. As we look to expand SIMP, we can improve catch documentation requirements and do our best to harmonize with other systems around the world. The US is not the only country that's doing this work, like in the European Union, to make compliance more streamlined for industry. And then also look to see what those key data elements can be on the labor front to make sure that we're catching products that are sourced from forced labor, human trafficking, and other human rights abuses in the supply chain. We need to put that information to work. The information that we collect needs to be used smartly. Let's inform risk-based screening and risk-based enforcement. We will never have the resources to inspect every lot, every boat, every shipping container, but we can use the information that we have to utilize our limited resources in the best way. We also need to expand traceability. We need to track the seafood from boat to plate, ensuring integrity at every stop in the supply chain. Without that, we have created a system with weak links. We need to embrace transparency in technology. We can no longer allow fishing to operate under separate rules under a cloak of secrecy. We need to shine a light to what is happening at sea, and that means that we need to embrace transparency in the US so that we can demand it elsewhere. And we need to use emerging technologies better to allow the US to do their job more efficiently and more effectively with the information that we do have. And then finally, the US is a global market, a large importer. We need to lead globally and use our market leverage to drive changes around the world. We need to ensure that countries who continue to fall short on their commitments to end IUU fishing in their fleet should not have equal access to our markets. We can take a lesson from the EU on this. Their willingness to impose red cards or sanctions and block imports from countries has led to massive improvements in the source countries. We need to ensure that US dollars are not supporting illegal fishing, forced labor, and other crimes at sea. And then that will, at the end of the day, ensure that the seafood sold in the US is safe and legally caught, responsibly sourced, and honestly labeled. So thank you for listening to my diatribe on what we need to do on illegal fishing. And for those of you who have worked in this space for a long time, I just want to thank you for your efforts that have helped us get to where we are. I don't want to I know I've put together a long list of the policies that we need in place to do better, and I don't want to lose sight that we've come a long way, but there's still more work to be done. And us on this panel and a lot of our colleagues out there on this call are all working to ensure that that happens.
Thank you so much, Beth, and thank you so much, Whit, Tabitha, Amy, for being here with your expertise in the forced labor space. So we don't have a ton of time. We have 4 questions so far. If folks could send more questions, that would be great. And I'm trying to use modern technology to sort through them. So I'll throw out 2 really quickly that I see in front of me. And I think it'd be great, maybe Tabitha and Whit, Beth obviously weigh in. I'll lay out both of them now. One is, there's been a lot of conversation about the China Belt and Road Initiative, obviously a huge connection between the US and China. Folks are wondering if we know more about the status of the US, EU, Canada trilateral and what the status of fishing or port infrastructure is in those initiatives. The second question is, great information on the Galapagos, the power of AAS and VMS to really show what is happening on the water is amazing. The Trump administration has obviously been very focused on the activity that's happening with the China jiggers right off the Galapagos. But there's been a lot less attention on what's happening in North Korean waters and in other places around the world, including Ghana and the Northwest Indian Ocean. Do we have a sense of what's happening in those places and why there is a sort of discrepancy in the type of attention that's happening? So US, EU, Canada trilateral, and what's the deal with the lack of attention for North Korea, Ghana, and the Northwest Indian Ocean? Tabitha, maybe we'll start with you, if you're okay.
Yeah, sure. So they're both great questions. For the first one about countering China's BRI and the Blue Dot Network, I don't know a lot of the details about the Blue Dot Network. I mean, my understanding is that it's the U.S. government's response to the BRI and providing some infrastructure standards, which I think is great. And I think the point I would want to add to that is that it's important that we work with other countries on this. So, our allies, which is what the Blue Dot Network is about, but also other countries that are, recipients of the Belt and Road Initiative projects. there's this overlay of U.S.-China relations that's, just really acrimonious and tense right now. And measures and moves on both sides are kind of perceived by the other side to be, just really aggressive, and in terms of the Chinese perception, that the U.S. is trying to contain China. But I think the U.S. is bringing up some really important governance considerations, and it's important for China to also hear some of those critiques and some of that feedback from the countries that are the recipients of some of this investment, and for them to kind of push back about the standards and everything. And so the extent to which we can bring more transparency about these issues and help increase knowledge about them, so that we can have kind of a more like global concerted approach, I think is just really useful. So for the second question about the high seas fleet versus fishing in EEZs of other countries, so it's I think it's a really great point. The fleet the Chinese fleet off the coast of the Galapagos is it's unregulated. So they are fishing really heavily for squid. Their fishing presence has gone up significantly just over the past 4 or 5 years. And it's in my mind to take advantage of the fact that squid is not yet regulated. The South Pacific Regional Fisheries Management Organization is the RFMO that regulates that area, all species aside from tuna. Tuna is pretty well regulated. But those vessels are pretty much all fishing for squid, and the SP RFMO is issuing some new measures on squid starting next year. So I suspect that a lot of the push this year that we're seeing is because the regulations are coming out next year. And so it's sure it's legal, but it doesn't mean that it's not unsustainable. So if you look at the vessels that are registered to the SP RFMO right now, there are about 1,100 of them, and 700 of them are Chinese. And so those vessels are, just fishing without really any kind of, so all of our global fisheries were at one point unregulated. And then it's, we've been trying to address that by increasing regulations through RFMOs. And, the issue with, Ghana and North Korea, so North Korea, before the UN sanctions happened, that was on the basis of a bilateral fisheries access agreement, which is, it's, I guess this brings me back to my first point, that we need more transparency about these agreements and help, these kind of recipient countries maybe push back a little bit if the terms aren't fair. But the violation there is really about the UN sanctions. China said it wasn't fishing there because of the UN sanctions, but they've had a robust program in North Korea before. So anyway, so I think one is kind of like a global approach to like getting some, the high seas fisheries better regulated. And then, the second approach for EEZ fishing is just increasing transparency and helping, some of these host countries with, their capabilities to enforce, some of the fishing activity.
Whit, do you want to add in something for 1 minute, and then we'll move on to some questions about KDs and transparency in AAS?
No, I think Tabitha gave great thoughts there. I would just add a couple points to both. One, I would say just, I thought the point Tabitha made about, hearing from other countries where the BRI is actually making investments in terms of sort of demand for standards is really critical. And part of that equation is, make sure that we have viable alternatives out there, or at least standards that we can set, the Blue Dot Network and other things as a model. China has the BRI Green Development Corporation, and to much fanfare at our Oceans last year, added oceans as a theme in the BRI development, Green Development Coalition. But I think, so far that's really an effort in greenwashing or blue washing, however you want to say it. And we need to encourage not just China, but the states where projects are being invested in to make it more than just a greenwashing effort, to really help call for standards through something like the BRIDC, to make that something that goes along with foreign investment. I would say that with respect to why are we getting more attention around the Galapagos, I think that's it's a complicated answer, probably has a lot to do with U.S. domestic politics, a current focus on China. I think that obviously the North Korea story is a China story too, but there's probably, issues around North Korea politics involved in how much the administration is pushing on that particular aspect there. So I think that it's something that is, there's clearly other reasons for why one issue is being highlighted over the other. But I do want to point out that although it is technically legal, I wouldn't call it, I would say it's illegal. It is, as Tabitha pointed out, it is unregulated around the Galapagos. And similarly in the Southwest Atlantic, unregulated. And there it's not just China, it's Korea and Taiwan and Spanish as well, though again, dominantly China, that is fishing in an unregulated way for, and oftentimes crossing over into EEZs, Argentine, and others. And I think that we shouldn't lose sight that just because it's not quote unquote technically illegal in the way that the North Korean violations were, that it doesn't also have a significant erosion and negative effect on global norms and governance. And I think for my part, that is really the key point. That we want to be in a position where we are arguing for increased global norms, increased comprehensive governance for oceans, because otherwise we're not going to have any fish left. And so wherever we can be pushing for governance structures, for management structures, for the application of global norms, more to the good. And so in that sense, I think, Galapagos matter quite a lot. Clearly North Korea matters significantly as well. We don't want to lose sight of that, but I do want to just kind of make that point.
Thank you so much, Whit. Beth, I'm going to bucket 3 questions for you, and then we're going to end just so people have a sense, unless there's an additional question, with what gives people hope, what's your biggest priority for what comes next. Again, with gratitude for everything that everyone has already done in this space. So Beth, your difficult questions, 3 of them. One, and Amy, it would be great to have your input on this if there's time. What KDEs do you think could be added to SIMP or to a similar vehicle? Obviously, it doesn't have to be SIMP. Forced labor, that's number 1. Number 2 is, how are things going with SIMP? And really, what comes next? Does it need more money, greater capacity? Does it make sense to expand to all species now, given where we are with the program? So just sort of a SIMP status check. And then the third one, hopefully I'm not piling on too much, really great visual on the AIS and the transparency piece. What comes next in terms of actually making use of AIS mandatory, and what happens if people turn their track off? Sort of a risk factor kind of question there. So KDs for forced labor, how are we doing on SIMP, and what comes next for AIS and VMS?
Wow, so that's a lot to squeeze into 2 minutes. Thanks, Roberta.
You have 2 minutes. And you can choose one part of that.
Okay,
so
that
makes more sense.
For labor KDEs, I think that's a work in progress, and really need to sit down with some of the groups that are working on labor, including Amy Lair, our colleague right here, on identifying what are information that can be reported that can signify for that. So Amy, I'll reserve like 30 seconds of my time to go to you in a second. So on standby. For SIMP implementation, the good thing is it is happening. I was just on a workshop on traceability with the Canadian government today, and one of their Canadian industry representatives were on the call and said that despite a few glitches in the beginning, they found it easy to comply with SIMP, which is great to hear, and they have not had major issues. Of course, it can always use more resources. We need to have dedicated bodies at NOAA that are responsible for analyzing that data, using it smartly, really focusing in on risk-based screening and targeted enforcement. But I don't think we can lose sight of waiting to have implementation perfect before we expand, because without expansion, we are creating a system with loopholes and weak links that can allow illegally caught fish to find another way into the US. And that's not the goal of the program. So we should close those openings that are allowing it in. Finally, on AIS, quickly, in the United States, commercial fishing vessels that are 65 feet or greater are required to use AIS. Other countries in the world have stronger requirements, including the EU. So it's anything that's about 49 feet or greater are required to use it for their entirety of their trip. By requiring an expansion of AIS use on the US commercial fleet, we could then push and demand for that elsewhere, which is needed, as you can see from some fishing around the world. We really need transparency to see what's happening. One quick thing on the gaps. Yes, you can turn off the AIS device, but the data also shows that too. So when we were looking at the gaps around the Galapagos Islands, we were limiting it to gaps in transmission that were 24 hours or greater, and then most of them were 2 days up to 17 days of gaps. So even though those devices can be turned off, the data also shows when it does that, and then you can use that for risk-based enforcement as one of the flags for AIS gaps. So let me just send it to Amy for some labor KDE update, and then I've went over my time.
Thanks, Beth. It's always better to be in the question asking mode than the question answering. So thank you for being succinct. Amy, and then we'll wrap up with what comes next, what gives you hope.
I'll be really quick. And just KDE is a key data element, and it's required under SIMP for a number of more sustainability related issues, but not for any labor rights related issues. This is something where we really want to do more consultation to get this right. If there are going to be labor related KDEs, I think figuring out what's really going to be impactful is important. Just throwing out some ideas, but I don't know that these are the answer, right? You can imagine having to say whether you had your fishing vessel audited and by whom. Were there migrant workers on it? What are their hours of work, which you could then check against vessel movement? You could require that they somehow demonstrate the workers were legal. I mean, there's things you could put there. The question is what's feasible and what's actually useful. And that's where, again, we want to do some more mutual thinking with others. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to everyone for joining. We're 2 minutes over. Let's close with thanks and your highest priority for what comes next. I will say that I'm thankful for so many smart, talented people working on these issues. That gives me a lot of hope for what comes next. I appreciate everyone for joining. We'll go in the order that we went coming in, so we can do Whit, Beth, and Amy, and then we will be seeing all of you in following conversations as we work to tackle these issues together. So parting thoughts, something positive, something action-oriented?
Yeah, I'll just say I was really, our event yesterday with the Coast Guard just left me really, really stoked. I have to say, seeing that level of attention from the Coast Guard Commandant on down and their commitment with this new strategy, strategic outlook in IU, man, that thing is really good. I encourage everybody to take a look at it. Devil's going to be an implementation, how they made forward with that, but I think that their priorities are really right on, and so I was thrilled to see that. And as Roberta said, I'm just also always thankful to see so many folks joining us for these kinds of events. So thank you all.
Yeah, I would also like to thank Roberta for moderating, Oceana for hosting, my fellow panelists for really, I mean, I learned a lot from your presentations too, and I always love hearing the questions from the audience. So thanks to everyone. I would say, like kind of two things that I keep it, well, I guess kind of one general thing I keep in my mind is, even though we're critical of the actions that China is taking, and I think it's really important to, point out, transgressions, I do also think it's really important to not completely demonize China and to cooperate with China when we can. Like they are taking some steps to address this problem, and we never got into the competing priorities. I think that's the, the reason why we see weird, these contradictions is because they do care, but they also have these other, priorities like status and economics. And, but, I think marine environment is an area that there can be a lot of cooperation. And then kind of the more technical thing I just wanted to add is, expanding SIMP to include the species that we, is a big part of the US seafood trade with China would be really helpful. So including squid, pollock, salmon. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
For me, I just want to acknowledge the progress that we've made. As I just mentioned, I was on a workshop with the Canadian government on how to do seafood traceability. They have a mandate to start where we were about 6 years ago. And so I was there to talk a lot about lessons learned from the US system and just acknowledge that we've made progress and know that after progress, then you have to make more progress and expand and improve upon what we've done before. And so it's doable. And it may seem hard, but in the end of the day, we can have real impacts on safe and legally caught, responsibly sourced, and honestly labeled seafood. And it's doable. We can do this. We just need to put the smart heads together and hammer out some concrete steps to move forward.
Terrific. Amy?
I work on a lot of different issues, and I think it's exciting to see the human rights and environmental communities talking to each other and learning from each other and trying to move forward together. I actually don't think that happens nearly as much as it should. So it's nice that in this space it sometimes does. And I'm hopeful that we can harness the information coming in to different agencies to make some more progress, particularly on forced labor and seafood, where we know there's a huge problem and very little enforcement.
Terrific. Well, thank you to everyone for joining. I know these are very difficult times in so many different ways, and we really appreciate your continued interest and work on these hard issues. And we will be following up in many different fora. So enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks, bye.